Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to contrast the Western leaders of the 1960s and earlier, say early 1970s and before, and compare them to the leaders that came afterwards, and an example of the leaders today. Now, out of all the Western nations today, there's only one leader that is actually leading a sovereign nation, or is battling to turn it into a sovereign nation, and that's President Trump. And that's the only one. Every other prime minister or president in the West is a globalist flunky stooge. They represent and act on the instructions of their masters are the globalist cabal. They do not represent the people or the electorate or their citizens. None of the Western countries are sovereign nations, other than, again, the United States with President Trump. But all the rest have ceded the sovereignty to the globalist cabal and the prime ministers and presidents of those countries in the West, who simply little fetch and carry, on their knees, gobbling flunky boys, doing what they're told by the globalists. It's very sad, actually, to see that sovereignty being lost. And it was within my lifetime of that sovereignty. Sovereign nations have gone from, Western nations have gone from being proud sovereign nations to being just pathetic little limp-wristed flunky boys and girls running around doing the bidding of the globalists. To what benefit, one can only sort of speculate. I can't see a single benefit out of it. Now, to sort of illustrate the point, I go back to the 1959-1960 presidential election in the United States, and the debate between Richard Nixon, who was the vice president of the Eisenhower administration, and John F. Kennedy, who was the candidate for the Democrat Party. In the end, Kennedy won the election with some very suspicious vote counting in some places, but in Chicago and parts of Texas, some very suspicious vote counting there. But nonetheless, Kennedy won by about 100,000 votes overall. And so this was hardly a ringing endorsement of his candidacy for president. But nonetheless, he won. But coming back to these debates, now, if you look at sort of the way AOC and the majority of people in the American Congress, how they behave, senators or members of the House of Representatives or state governors, it doesn't matter. If you look at how they behave and how they speak and how they articulate ideas, the sort of ideas they put forward, their grasp of detail or lack of it, as the case may be, you're talking, I mean, you could say you've gone to a different planet. You've gone from, the seasoned executives in the boardroom, and you've gone to the high school debating team or something. That's the difference we're talking here. And it's hard to believe that someone like AOC could even have existed back then. But now, today, it's hard to believe that somebody like a JFK or Richard Nixon would exist today. So this is the difference we're talking about here. And it happened sort of, I think, more quickly than we realize. Now, I'll put a link in the description here, so I invite people to just look at that debate and make the comparison themselves. But Richard Nixon had an impressive command of detail. And remember, he's not reading off a teleprompter. These people are just talking. They've had to memorize this. They've had to practice their speech, and they've have to be quick enough thinking on their feet to be able to communicate these messages. And also consider, at the time, the television was still a relatively new medium, and people were still getting used to it, and politicians were still getting used to the idea of talking into the TV camera rather than going to public town hall meetings or talking into the radio or something like that. So Now, Richard Nixon had been again vice president for 8 years in the Eisenhower Republican administration. His knowledge of foreign policy, his dealing with issues such as within the Cold War and dealing with the Russians and all this sort of thing. His command of detail and his presentation of the facts was quite impressive. Compared to today's standards, he was a towering sort of a presence. But just putting it on, at the time, he was quite clearly angling to be or applying for and asking for the votes of the public to become leader of a sovereign nation. A sovereign nation where the people and Nixon were to improve the lives of people, to improve the standard of living, to improve the safety, and so on and so forth. And again, it was the Cold War, so there's a lot of rhetoric about it. If those Russians don't behave themselves, we're going to kick some ass. There was those. I wasn't phrased like that, by the way, but those sentiments were Kennedy's latest speech. We will bear any burden, oppose any foe in protection of freedom, and this sort of stuff. Now, Kennedy was less impressive, and he spoke in inspirational, big vision, big ticket stuff like, I think America can be a greater place. It's a great place, but it can be greater, much greater. And I think we can. So there's a lot of vision type stuff there, and big ticket. Nixon was much better at commanding the detail, which he probably overdid a little bit. Not everyone can follow that. They can be emotionally inspired by the grand vision, which Kennedy's advisors told him to stick to. Nixon tried to indicate his expertise for the job as if he was at a job interview, which it kind of was, I suppose, by showing his mastery of detail and his deep understanding of the issues. And if you take it from someone like myself that's been looking at politics for a while, I thought he was the more impressive speaker there. Not in the grand vision stuff, but in the he appeared to be, in my view, in a detailed terms, the far more competent of the two. Now, in terms of Kennedy was a bit of a lightweight in reality, and when you take away the grand vision stuff that he talks about, and he was schooled for a million hours in front of the camera to how to come across as confident and self-assured and well qualified to be president, this sort of thing. But that was all just media training. It wasn't anything else. And this to me, when someone's got too much media training, I spot it now. I didn't notice it years ago when I was a kid or something, but I can spot it. And the media training is not a substitute for competence and mastery of the issues. And Kennedy was a media trained guy. Nixon had less media training, even though he'd been vice president for that amount of time, but had less media training. So he stuck to the facts, the details, and again, demonstrating his competence to efficiently and knowledgeably run the administration. So I thought Nixon was the better player there. There were two debates. I mean, one of them, Nixon, when he's getting out, the car fell over, I think injured his knee, or the door hit him in his knee, and so he was in quite a bit of pain there. I think it was the second presidential debate, and that came across. He seemed to be sweating under the camera and under the lights in front of the camera, and made him look slightly twitchy and nervous. But nonetheless, Kennedy, by sticking to the format his handlers gave him and sticking to the grand vision stuff of I envision America that becomes a greater place, and that sort of that big sort of big ticket stuff. It sounds good and gives you that warm feeling in your gut, but it's got no facts, reality, or anything. Anyone could say something like that. I believe a place where there's a pot of gold at the end of every rainbow. So, and Kennedy's speeches really didn't deviate too far from that. Although he was quite a good speaker, the self-assured, confident sort of, I'm ready to run the country. Look how self-assured and confident I am. That did come across, but that was again his media training, not not anything else. The guy hadn't passed any legislation. He'd done the heavy lifting on policy or anything like that at all. He was on, compared to Nixon, at least quite a lightweight. Nonetheless, Kennedy got across the line and became president. So now when we compare the Nixon-Kennedy debates, and we'll just fast forward 20 years to the Reagan-Mondale debate. And so this is Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. And Walter Mondale was the Democrat candidate. The Democrats even tried then to play the gender card, and they put Geraldine Ferraro in as vice president or the running mate with Mondale. I think that cost him quite a lot of votes. And even back then, they go, well, that just shows how many Nazis there are out there, rather than saying, well, no, it was a bad choice. Why did you do that? You played the gender card very cynically, and it blew up in your face. Too bad. You shouldn't have done it, rather than accuse the voters of all being Nazis. But listening to Reagan and Mondale, now, neither one of them were even anywhere, I believe, anywhere near as impressive as Nixon and Kennedy were. Neither one of them seemed to have mastery of knowledge of detail. They all talked in platitudes, and it was, you could already see the conversation and debate devolving into, I'm not a Nazi, I'm not Hitler, therefore vote for me. The other guy's Hitler, but I'm not. That type of thing. That sort of structural nature of the debate was already, and neither one of them impressive. Mondale sounded like a funny. He spoke slowly. He seemed to be unsure of himself. And they had the benefit then. They were starting to use the teleprompter thing at the time. One thing that impressed me about Trump, President Trump, in the campaign, was he was often able just to talk straight off the top of his head, whereas the other people, they all had to use the teleprompters and had to have a lot of media coaching. Trump just spoke as a person to the people, and that made him, I believe, that made him far more relatable as a candidate. I mean, Biden didn't fucking know what day it was. Now, the other thing that really sticks out, I mean, this really sticks out, is the people the journalists asking the questions. And the moderator, they bent over triple backwards to appear scrupulously impartial. They didn't try and talk down one candidate over another. They were, if they were partisan, I couldn't detect it. They were scrupulous in their effort to be seen as impartial and to be impartial. To ask it, and they would say the rules are, we ask you a question, you've got 5 minutes, and then the other person, the other candidate has got 2 minutes to respond, then you get 1 minute to respond to their response. And so it was done on a very legal, the cross-examination, examination, cross-examination, re-examination. It was done in that sort of 3-tier stage that you would see in evidence testing in a courtroom. So I was very impressed with the impartiality of the media. If I've understood it correctly, they were given, each candidate was given the list of 100 journalists. This is obviously pre-internet and where print media still had huge sway. But it was, they get a list of 100 journalists, and they each side had to agree on 3 journalists who would be the questioning panel. So it couldn't be like this guy's preferred one, but that guy didn't want them. They both had to agree on the 3 journalists. Compare that now to the way the media, these debates treated President Trump. They were, over the top partisan hacks, did everything they could to fuck him up at every turn and run protection for Biden or Kamala or any of the other, 2-bit candidate, globalist control candidates. The way they ran control for Biden in that the that 2020 election. That was disgraceful. And way they did that, the way they gave soft treatment to the Democrat people. But I saw an interview they did with Kerry Ann, and she they treated her like shit. It was an ambush, and they were like putting the boot in it left, right, and centre. I think it was called a political show called With All Due Respect, I think it was called. And they went after her to just but then by comparison, when the Democrat equivalent was on, it was very soft shoe, very soft ball questions, which I assume they'd been given in advance. So the difference in what are the two big differences? These were two leaders who were appealing, saying that they were going to run a sovereign nation, and they reported to the people and the voters, and the impartiality of the media. Those two things stuck out a mile. And the difference. Now, if we look at the 1980 debate, already it was going along gender race lines. So the Women's Caucus, Political Caucus of America, it was an all women, the women's view, and all women asking. The moderator was female, and we want to hear what you're going to do for women. Well, hold on a minute. This is President of the United States, not the President of women, or the President of men, or the President of children, or the President of this. So that's the President of the United States. What business have you to come and say you have to prove that you're going to do things for women? What? Excuse me? So already there was a debasement, a level of debasement and subversion already well underway by 1980. And it showed in the sort of candidate, I believe. Now, remember Ronald Reagan? He's supposed to be the guy who beat communism and Star Wars and da-da-da. He was the guy that allowed millions of illegals to come into the United States, then give them amnesty, do all sorts of things for furthering making divorce. The divorce industry really took off. During the Reagan years, including his time as governor of California. So when we look at Ronald Reagan's contribution, communism was already, Soviet communism was already staggering along under the burden of its own inefficiency. Gorbachev tried to modernize it, but he was too late to the party. It was already a lost cause. Even at that point, he was also undermined at every turn in what he tried to do. So that was already staggering along. The idea that America bankrupted the Soviet Union by Star Wars or something, that's just a fucking fairy tale. So already, I believe we can see that the globalists were already moving into position and already taking control, even in 1980. The idea that the candidates for president have to be questioned by an activist bunch of women as to, the questions asked by women to show up. What? Are you kidding me? So already we're seeing that subversion, which then became race, which then became LGBTQ, and we can see that subversion clearly in motion. Now, the same can be said for the, say, in Europe. If you look at the prime ministership of, say, Harold Macmillan in England, Britain, the United Kingdom, in the late 1950s. You look at the decisions they're making. You sort of read his memoirs and diaries of the day. He believed himself to be the prime minister of a sovereign nation. Now, sure, Britain couldn't make just completely independent decisions on all things without, particularly foreign policy, without discussing it with Washington first. That was how things were at the time. Britain had bankrupted itself in World War II, so it still had to crawl and grovel to the United States to a large extent for financial reasons. But Britain was still a sovereign nation, and you can see their behaviour. The behaviour of the Prime Minister of the time, again using Harold Macmillan as an indication, who was around the time of Kennedy and Nixon, and yet you compare that to, say, Tony Blair and the Prime Minister, certainly that came after, or John Major in his later years. All of these people were globalist flunkies. to varying degrees, but globalist flunkies nonetheless. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback challenge. Thank you for listening.